So the two techniques of pre-cooling that I would recommend in football are either, or I say either, but it's both using an ice vest. The ice vest is very convenient because you can minimize the increase in core temperature while still having the adaptation to the warm-up. And you can use it also on the bench while being a substitute. You can use it at halftime. It's very convenient to use, the ice vest. And the second technique that could be very useful is also what we call the internal cooling by drinking cold water or even iced water or ice slurry.
Welcome to FSI Talks, where football experts from around the world share practical and updated knowledge with the FSI community.
Welcome to FSI Talk, where the best experts in the world come together to talk about football. I'm Alberto Fílter, your host, and today we are focusing on an exciting topic that's critical for football players: heat and cold management. We will be exploring the latest strategies to improve performance in different conditions and recover faster based on the most recent paper. Whether you are a coach, player, or just a fan of the game, this episode will give you knowledge into how to manage hot and cold in football. So to talk about that, we have with us the best expert on the world in this topic, that is Sebastien Racinais. Thank you so much, Sebastien, for being part of FSI Talk.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay, the first question is easy. It's our overview of your professional and academic background for our community.
So my name is Sebastien Racinais. I'm working for the Crêpes of Montpellier-Font-Romeu in the south of France, developing an environmental stress unit where we are offering training solutions mixing heat and altitude for elite athletes. I'm also in charge of that question about extreme environmental conditions for the IOC, where I am the chairman of the working group of that question and a member of the IOC Games Group.
Okay, it's amazing, your background. So today we are going to talk about, we are focused on temperature management thinking in football within pre-match, match, and post-match strategies to guarantee performance maintenance. So the first question, let's start talking about thermal stress and how temperature can affect neuromuscular function in football.
So we know that temperature is affecting neuromuscular function as well as cardiovascular function. And there is a lot of measures that have been done in various sports, both on the field and in the laboratory. What is very interesting with football is that we get a mix of the effect of temperature on various sports. So for example, when we look at a football game, and what I say now has been verified both in experimental setting, but also at the highest level. For example, we did some measurements during the Brazil World Cup, where some games were played in hot condition and others in temperate condition. And what we saw is that when a game is played in hot condition, there is a lower distance covered at high intensity by the player. So there is a slowing down of the game, and this is the same thing that you will observe in an individual endurance sport. The game is going a bit slower because the players are covering less distance when the environmental temperature is high. On the other side, the sprint, the maximal speed of the player is not affected. And this is also what we are observing when we are looking, for example, at a 100-meter sprint in athlete. For football, it's very interesting because it's a mix of different sports. So the maximal velocity of your player is not affected, but its ability to cover a lot of distance at high velocity is affected. And we also see an effect of temperature of some specific component of a football game, such as the rate of success in passes, for example. And that is a bit surprising because when the game is played in hot condition, the rate of success of the passes and crosses is improved. I repeat, it is not impaired, it is improved. And it's a bit counterintuitive for a lot of coaches who do not think to that. But when you think to that, it's a bit logical because if you run less, the opponent is also running less, so you get more time to adjust and to receive your passes. But at the end, it's very important when you put everything together. If you are a coach and your game strategy is based on a lot of physical pressure, is based on a lot of running at high intensity, this is a recipe for failure in the heat because your player will not be able to run a lot at high intensity in the heat. So when you are planning a game in the heat, you need to adapt your game strategy to the physiology of your player, and you need to rely on a game based on passes.
Yeah, okay, it's amazing. Okay, so let's imagine a football match, okay? And let's start with a warm-up. Specifically, what's different we can find between warm-up in hot, humid versus cold condition?
The warm-up is one of the important parts to adapt before a game in the heat or before a competition in the heat. But I said to adapt, not to delete. So the aim of a warm-up is not only to increase the temperature. We call that a warm-up, so we think that it's only to warm up the objective. But when you do a warm-up, you do much more than increasing the temperature of the player. You have some temperature-dependent adaptation, and you have also some other adaptations that are not temperature-dependent. You will increase, for example, there is psychological effect of the warm-up. There is effect, for example, of the temperature on the dissociation of the oxygen from the hemoglobin. There is an effect on the elasticity of the tissue and so on. So there is a range of effects that you still want to get even if you are playing in the heat. But what you want to do is to decrease the first part of the warm-up. The first part of the warm-up, this part that you do generally a low intensity, where the aim of it is to increase the temperature of the player. This part should be decreased because you do not want to increase too much the temperature of the player because his temperature will rise faster and higher when playing in the heat. So you want to reduce that first part of the warm-up and focus only on the second part of the warm-up where you do more the technical and tactical drills.
Okay. Do you think that using a pre-cooling strategy in clubs is good for the club that compete in heat condition?
So pre-cooling is a good strategy in the condition that it does not interfere with the warm-up. So for example, if you are thinking as pre-cooling immersion in the cold bath, then there is a contradiction between the warm-up and cold bath water immersion. Do you do the water immersion, then warm-up, so you are losing the effect of the water immersion? Or do you do the warm-up, then the water immersion, so you are losing the effect of the warm-up? So there is some good pre-cooling strategy, but you should not cool down the main muscles that are important for the activity. So you should focus mainly on the upper body. So the two techniques of pre-cooling that I would recommend in football are either, or I say either, but it's both using an ice vest. The ice vest is very convenient because you can minimize the increase in core temperature while still adding the adaptation to the warm-up. And you can use it also on the bench while being a substitute. You can use it at halftime. It's very convenient to use the ice vest. And the second technique that could be very useful is also what we call the internal cooling by drinking cold water or even iced water or ice slurry.
Okay, okay. So thinking now about safety of the player with the aim to guarantee the safety condition during football matches in heat condition, what recommendation and regulation do you consider essential from organization point of view? Come to my mind, for example, the cooling break. And do you think that we can have another more?
So when we talk about the safety of the players, there is different level of responsibility. There is the rules, what the international federation can do. And as you said, the FIFA has implemented cooling break or hydration break, you call them as you want, since 2008 and the final of the Olympics in Beijing. So for 16 years now, there has been cooling break in football. This is what can be done at the level of the federation. But there is also action that can be taken at the level of the game organizer. For example, by scheduling the game appropriately, avoiding the hottest time of the day, is what has been done in most of the recent mega events, such as, for example, very recently at the Olympic in Paris. In the original schedule, there was some game in the early afternoon in Marseille, but it was a very hot time of the day in the south of France in Marseille. So it was decided to have the early game in another city and to have the game in Marseille starting a bit later to try to avoid the hottest time of the day in one of the hottest cities in France. So those are countermeasures that can be taken at the level of the organizer. But there is also countermeasures that need to be taken by the athlete, by the players, and by the team themselves. And the most important one is probably to train in the heat.
Okay.
By training in the heat, the player can dramatically reduce the effect of the heat strain on his body, and that will be beneficial both for his health and his performance. But we will come back to that, I believe, a bit later on. And there is a second aspect that needs to be looked at by the team doctor. This is the current health status of the player. We know from epidemiological measures in various sports that the two main risk factors for a player suffering an adverse event when playing in the heat is to not be heat acclimatized, that means to do not have trained in the heat, and the second one is to have suffered recently any illness, especially a gastrointestinal issue with a diarrhea. We know that is dramatically increasing the chance of the player to suffer an adverse event. So if you have some players who have been ill with a gastrointestinal issue very recently, this week, it's probably better to focus on them and probably leave them rest a bit when playing in the heat.
Okay, you talk about heat training. So could you provide us, for example, what is the benefits of heat training in heat condition?
So the human body in general is very plastic. That means that we adapt to what we are exposed to. This is the basic of training. Your training, you develop some adaptation to your training. And this is the same with the heat. If you are training in the heat, you develop specific adaptation that will help you to better perform in the heat. So for example, you will increase your sweating capacity. So that will allow you to better thermoregulate when you're playing in the heat. You will increase your plasma volume. That will allow you to reduce the cardiovascular stress when you are playing in the heat. And all of those together are efficient when playing in the heat. We did some measures with players where we measure their physiological adaptation in the laboratory, and we also measure their ability to run during a football game in the heat. And we saw that both of them were pretty well correlated. So the players who are able to acclimate, that means to develop specific adaptation when training in the heat, are roughly able to maintain almost the same level of activity when playing in the heat than what they do when they play in a temperate environment. But the players who do not adapt to the heat have to decrease their level of activity. So for example, their distance cover by 5, 10, 15% when playing in the heat. So heat acclimation works to protect the player's health, but it also works to improve the player performance and physical capacity when he's playing in the heat.
Okay, direct to the point. For you, what is the range of degrees in which football players should train in heat condition?
So it's a continuum. It's not an on-off. It's a continuum, and often when we are in between, the coach is wondering, should I train in the heat or not? Because it is not sure that the game will be played in a hot ambient condition. I would say, if you are in between, still train in the heat. Why? Because there is no downside at training in the heat. Even if you train in the heat and the game is not played in hot conditions, so it's played in temperate or even cold condition, there is no negative effect in that. There is no downside, so you have nothing to lose. But if there is any chance that the game is played in hot condition and your players are not trained in the heat, then they will suffer a dramatic reduction in their exercise capacity. And this is not to give you a range of what I mean by training in the heat. I don't talk about something very stressful. For example, you can get the adaptation just by doing very moderate intensity exercise in hot ambient condition. To develop heat acclimation, you need 4 things roughly. You need to increase your core temperature, but that you do it as long as you exercise. You need to increase your skin temperature. You need to increase your sweat rate, and you need to increase your skin blood flow. This is what will induce specific physiological adaptation. So basically, what does that mean if you're not able to measure the skin blood flow or the temperature of your player? It's just somebody who is, to speak very simply, sweaty and a bit red. If you are sweaty and reddish, that means that you are increasing your sweat rate, you are increasing your skin blood flow, and so on. So as long as your player displays those symptoms because they are training in the heat in the middle of the day, because you schedule a bit, you're training differently, or you do that indoor. It's very simple to do it. You just put a heater in a closed room and you generate some heat. And you make them run a bit on a treadmill or cycle a bit on an ergometer, and you can develop some adaptation. And those adaptations are relatively fast. It's just in a few days. 1 to 2 weeks, it's more than enough to develop adaptation in players. For most of the players, some of the players may take a bit longer.
Okay, I absolutely agree with your statement. But you know that some staff feel fear to put players in this condition because they don't control. What metric do you consider basic to control, to monitor during training in heat condition?
The easiest metric is probably heart rate. The most specific one is temperature, but temperature, there is a cost associated to that. There is an inconvenience associated to that. Heart rate is very easy to monitor. Most of the team are already monitoring heart rate anyway. And by looking at the relationship between heart rate and work rate, you have a very good idea of the acute effect of the heat on the player. If his heart rate is much higher for the same workload, or his workload is much lower for the same heart rate, that means that he's suffering about the heat. And you can see the difference between the hot ambient condition and temperate condition reducing days after days. That means that your player is adapting. To give you a very simple example, let's say that you are doing an exercise you are running at 12 kilometers an hour. Your player normally has a heart rate of 140 BPM when he does that in temperate ambient condition. You are in the heat, his heart rate is 160 and going up. So he's suffering about the heat. But if he does that days after days, you will see that little by little, his heart rate will decrease a little bit again.
Okay, if you, for example, don't have the hot condition in your country, could you simulate that, for example, in a camera in another place after the training, the specific training of football?
So there is two big group of training in the heat. There is indeed going to a hot country and doing a training camp in hot ambient condition. This is what we call heat acclimatization. And there is a second group of training, what we call heat acclimation, that is just about simulating hot ambient condition for 1 hour, 1 hour and a half a day, no more than that, during training, or in some cases, even passive. And for that, there is a range of methods to do that. So you can go in a sport institute, as our sport institute, where we have a large room where we can control the temperature and humidity, and we can make your player train during even specific exercise thanks to the size of the room in hot ambient condition. But if you do not have that, just go in a smaller room, put a few heaters, increase the temperature of the room around 40 degrees, and ask your player to run on a treadmill or even to do a various range of exercise. And that will work. If you do not want to do that, you can also use passive heat exposure. That means what? That means at the end of your training, rather than to cool down, you ask your player to immerse in a hot bath for 30 minutes in a bath at around 40, 42 Celsius degree after the training. So once they already increase their temperature during training, then you will stress a bit their thermoregulatory system by putting them in a hot bath. So there is a range of techniques. The one that we do will depend about the schedule of the player. How many days do we have? How long do we have during a day? This is a discussion with the coach. Generally, I never give a standard training plan to a player. We always sit with the coach and we say, based on your calendar, we believe that you can fit a hot session that day, that day, that day. Ideally, you want at least 5 sessions in a week, because if you do only 1 session every 10 days, it is not enough to develop specific adaptation. But 5 times during the week, we will try to put a form of heat exposure. One day it may be training in the heat. One day it may be a bit running in a hot room. One day it may be going for a hot bath. We will play around. The important thing is trying to have at least 5 sessions per week, ideally for 2 weeks, but at least for one week.
Okay, and on the other side, imagine that you compete in cold condition. Could you take advantages of train in heat condition to compete in the other side, in the cold condition?
That's a very interesting question. And I remember we did one of the pioneer study on that back in 2010 and 2011, working in AFL, so Australian Football League. And when we as a player, some of the players were training with altitude, some others were training with heat. Actually, all were training with heat, but some with and some without altitude. And what we observe is that the team training in the heat has a much better pre-season improvement during their pre-season training camp that they generally do in the history of the club that was historically doing some altitude training camp. So after that, there was a bit of a buzz in the press with a lot of people claiming that heat is a new altitude and you can improve your performance in any environment thanks to training in the heat and so on. It is not as simple as that. What is sure is that it's never negative. So training in the heat will never be negative for playing in other conditions. Is it positive? It depends on the sport and depend on the level of physical fitness of the player. So when we work with athletes who are already at their physiological limits, such as marathon runner, elite cyclists, and so on, it seems like even if you train them in the heat, they have already saturated, let's say, their physical capacity, and you cannot really get more from them. But with football players, and especially as pre-season, that appears to work pretty well to get much faster improvement in your pre-season training camp, for example, when you are doing them in the heat, as compared to that not having heat. We did similar projects in other sports also, in rugby, where you have a bit of similar capacity than football with the French Rugby Federation, comparing players having heat and altitude, having altitude, or having only an intensified training camp. And to make a long story short, I would say that in order of priority, the most important thing is first your training plan. Then heat or altitude are the cherry on the cake. But before to put the cherry on the cake, you need to bake the cake. So you need to have a good training plan with a good and healthy life habits and so on with your players. So this is the base. Implement good training practice, good training habits. And once you have that, then heat may give you a bit more, may give you a bit of an additional edge, a bit of a marginal gain, especially as pre-season or mid-season training.
Okay, absolutely agree. I really think that heat training is underrated nowadays. So let's change the topic. Let's talk about recovery. Mm-hmm. For you, what is the difference to use cold or hot condition to recover player?
Yeah. So the topic of cold water immersion for recovery is very interesting because there has been a big fashion of that lately, with a lot of players and a lot of, not only players, a lot of athletes in every sport doing a lot of cold water immersion after every type of training. And I would not recommend cold water immersion after every type of training. Cold water immersion may be very interesting in some specific cases because it may improve your recovery, and in any case, it will improve your feeling because it's having an antalgic effect, you will feel better. So that's very interesting if you are playing a tournament with a game every few days, then cold water immersion may be useful in that case in between the game. That may be very interesting, especially if you have been playing in hot ambient conditions because you will lower the heat stress. But I will take the opposite example. Let's say you are pre-season, you have a player doing a lot of resistance training, trying to gain some muscle mass. In that case, stay away from cold water immersion because it will stop protein synthesis and it will totally block your player from gaining muscle mass. So there is time in the year, especially during a tournament, for example, where you want cold water immersion, but there is time in the year, for example, during a pre-season training where you want training meditation, where you do not want cold water immersion.
Okay, and between dry and wet condition, between dry and, for example, cold water immersion?
So in terms of the efficacy of the cooling, it will depend on the transfer of heat between the body and the environment. And we know the transfer of thermal energy is much greater in water than in the air. So if you go in cold air or use just pure cold air, you will have a superficial effect, which is good for a psychological effect, which is good for the pain and so on, but will not have a deep effect on the tissue. If you want a deep effect on the tissue, you probably need to go either for a very aggressive cooling system, such as whole body cryotherapy, but those systems are generally very expensive, very cumbersome, and have never demonstrated any additional effect as compared to cold water immersion. So I will simply go for cold water immersion, which is both cheap, doable, and efficient.
Absolutely. Okay, Sebastian. So the last question is about the future. What is the future of that in football? Because I imagine football player in the cooling break with ice vest. I don't know. What is the future?
So I like to say that the future is already here. And if we look at what we are doing now, it's already very different to what we were doing 10 or 20 years ago. So for example, you mentioned the ice vest, and now the ice vest is are quite common on side of the pitch. And this is very, very common to see a lot of athletes wearing ice vest, not only at elite level, even amateur athletes in various sports. But there is much more coming on there. For example, in terms of monitoring technology. So monitoring has improved a lot in football, as in other sports lately with GPS and so on. But now we have solutions allowing to monitor the physiological response of a player in real time, in terms of temperature, in terms of heart rate, and so on. And those solutions are going there. And in the future, the coach will be able to have a screen in front of him with all of his players on the screen, and he will know in real time the physiological responses of his player. Is that player hyperthermic? Should I substitute my player? Is that player okay? Can he run more? All of those data will be available to the coach. After, what you do with the data is a different question. Having the data is the future of technology. We know that technology is going there, wearable technology is going there, real-time technology is going there, artificial intelligence is coming, artificial intelligence is coming. So we know that the technology is getting there. Now the question is more about what can we do with all of those data? How can we help the coach, the fitness coach, the data scientist to interpret correctly those data?
Absolutely. Okay, Sebastian, thank you so much for your provide us your knowledge about that. It's been a great pleasure having you here. Thank you so much. Yeah, for me, it's a master class.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be with you.
Okay, thank you to the listener, and see you in the next episode of FSI Talk.